Captain Marcus Chen had been flying jets for 15 years, but he had never met anyone quite like Sarah Williams. She worked as a meteorologist at the regional airport, and everyone knew her for one thing: she was always right about the weather. While other forecasters sometimes missed storms or got temperatures wrong, Sarah seemed to have a sixth sense about what the sky would do next. Marcus first noticed Sarah 3 months ago when he was preparing for a routine cargo flight to Denver. She had approached him near his aircraft, clipboard in hand, her expression serious. Most ground crew kept their distance from pilots, but Sarah walked right up to him without hesitation. "Captain Chen," she had said, looking directly at him with sharp green eyes. "I know the official forecast shows clear skies, but I'm seeing some unusual pressure readings. There's a storm system moving in faster than predicted. You might want to delay takeoff by 2 hours." Marcus had looked at her skeptically. He was scheduled to depart in 30 minutes, and delaying would mean missing his delivery window. The official weather report showed perfect flying conditions: clear skies, light winds, and good visibility. His instruments confirmed everything looked normal. "I appreciate the concern," he had replied politely, "but the weather service says we're good to go. I've got a tight schedule to keep." Sarah had nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I understand, just be careful out there. The atmosphere is more unstable than it appears." Marcus had taken off on schedule that day. 40 minutes into the flight, he encountered the worst turbulence of his career. Lightning flashed around his cockpit and hail pounded his windshield. He had to make an emergency landing in Kansas City, 2 hours behind schedule and with minor damage to his aircraft. When he returned the next day, Sarah was waiting with a knowing look and a cup of coffee. "How was Denver?" she had asked with a slight smile. From that moment, Marcus began paying attention to Sarah Williams. He learned that she had studied atmospheric science at MIT and had worked for the National Weather Service before taking the job at their small regional airport. Other pilots swore by her predictions, even when they contradicted official forecasts. She had an uncanny ability to read subtle signs that others missed: tiny changes in wind patterns, unusual cloud formations, or pressure variations that most people ignored. Despite her accuracy, Marcus found himself resistant to her warnings. He was the experienced pilot who prided himself on making his own decisions. He had flown through storms, navigated around hurricanes, and handled equipment failures with calm professionalism. The idea that he needed weather advice from someone who had never piloted an aircraft bothered him more than he cared to admit. Over the following weeks, their interactions became a familiar routine. Sarah would approach him before difficult flights, offering detailed warnings about conditions ahead. Marcus would listen politely, thank her for the information, and then proceed with his original flight plan. Sometimes her predictions proved wrong, which only reinforced his belief that he knew better. But more often than not, her warnings turned out to be accurate. Other pilots at the airport began joking about their dynamic. "There goes Marcus ignoring the weather witch again," they would say with good-natured laughter. Sarah had earned the nickname not out of disrespect, but because her predictions seemed almost magical in their precision. She could look at a clear blue sky and tell you exactly when clouds would appear. The tension between them wasn't personal. Marcus actually found Sarah interesting and intelligent. She could discuss complex meteorological phenomena with the same ease that he talked about aircraft systems. During their brief conversations, he discovered she was originally from Oregon, loved hiking in her spare time, and had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard. But when it came to flying decisions, Marcus trusted his experience over her forecasts. Sarah, for her part, seemed frustrated by his stubborn independence. She would shake her head when he dismissed her warnings, sometimes muttering under her breath about cowboy pilots who thought they knew everything, yet she continued to seek him out before every flight, as if she felt responsible for his safety whether he wanted her help or not. The morning of February 15th started like any other. Marcus arrived at the airport before dawn to prepare for a cargo run to Minneapolis. It was supposed to be a routine flight, medical supplies and emergency equipment for a hospital network. The weather forecast showed cold but clear conditions across the entire route, with temperatures around -10 degrees Fahrenheit at cruising altitude. As Marcus completed his pre-flight inspection, checking fuel levels and testing control surfaces, he spotted Sarah walking across the tarmac toward him. She moved with more urgency than usual, her breath visible in the frigid morning air. Even from a distance, he could see the concerned expression on her face. "Marcus," she called out as she approached. "We need to talk about this flight." He looked up from his clipboard, already preparing his polite but firm response. "Good morning, Sarah. What's the concern today?" "The concern is that you're about to fly into a death trap," she said bluntly. "I've been tracking the weather patterns all night, and there's something very wrong with the atmospheric conditions over the Great Lakes region." Marcus glanced at his weather briefing documents. Everything looked normal according to the official reports. The forecast shows clear skies and standard winter temperatures. "I don't see any red flags." "That's exactly the problem," Sarah replied, pulling out her tablet to show him a complex weather map. "Look at these pressure readings. There's a massive Arctic air mass moving down from Canada, but it's interacting with warmer air in ways that don't match the official predictions. The temperature differential is extreme. We're talking about air that's 50 degrees colder than normal at your cruising altitude." Marcus studied the data she was showing him, but it looked like standard winter weather patterns to him. Cold air moving south was normal for February in the Midwest. "I've flown through cold weather before, Sarah. This doesn't look unusual." "This isn't just cold weather," she insisted. "This is the kind of temperature extreme that can cause catastrophic aircraft icing. Your de-icing systems aren't designed for air that's minus 60 degrees. At those temperatures, moisture in the air can freeze instantly on contact with your aircraft surfaces." "My plane has full de-icing capability," Marcus replied. "Standard equipment for winter flying." Sarah's frustration was evident in her voice. "Standard de-icing systems work in normal cold weather. What you're flying into isn't normal. This is an Arctic blast that's going to turn your aircraft into a flying ice cube. Please, Marcus, delay this flight by 6 hours. Let this air mass pass through completely." Marcus looked at his watch. His cargo was time-sensitive medical supplies that a hospital was expecting by noon. Delaying would mean the delivery wouldn't arrive until evening, potentially affecting patient care. He had flown this route dozens of times in winter conditions and never encountered any serious problems. "I appreciate the warning," he said finally, "but I need to make this delivery on schedule. The Weather Service hasn't issued any advisories and my aircraft is properly equipped for winter flying." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. This time you're really making a mistake." Marcus completed his final pre-flight checks while Sarah watched from a distance. He could feel her eyes on him as he tested the control surfaces and verified fuel quantities. The morning air was bitter cold, around minus 15 degrees, but his aircraft was designed for these conditions. The twin-engine cargo plane had been flying through harsh winters for years without any serious problems. As he climbed into the cockpit, Marcus pushed away any doubts about Sarah's warning. She meant well, but she didn't understand the realities of commercial aviation. Delays cost money, affected schedules, and disappointed customers. Pilots couldn't ground flights every time a meteorologist had a bad feeling about the weather. The engines started smoothly, their familiar rumble reassuring in the cold morning air. Marcus contacted the control tower and received clearance for takeoff. As he taxied toward the runway, he caught a glimpse of Sarah standing near the terminal building, arms crossed, watching his aircraft with obvious concern. The takeoff went perfectly. His plane lifted off into clear skies, climbing steadily through the frigid morning air. Below him, the landscape was covered in snow, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The flight path would take him northeast over Wisconsin and Michigan before turning northwest toward Minneapolis. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. Marcus maintained his cruising altitude of 28,000 feet, monitoring instruments and enjoying the smooth ride. The outside air temperature registered minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold but not unusual for winter flying at that altitude. His de-icing systems were functioning properly, keeping critical surfaces clear of ice buildup. But as he crossed into Wisconsin airspace, Marcus began noticing subtle changes. The outside temperature dropped more rapidly than expected, falling to minus 45 degrees. Ice crystals started forming on his windshield faster than normal, requiring more frequent activation of the de-icing systems. The air seemed thicker somehow, as if the extreme cold was changing its density in unexpected ways. Marcus adjusted his heating controls and increased power to the de-icing systems. The aircraft was still flying normally, but he could feel slight changes in its handling characteristics. The control surfaces felt slightly less responsive, as if the cold air was affecting the aircraft's aerodynamics. He made a mental note to mention these observations in his post-flight report. As he approached the Michigan border, the situation began deteriorating rapidly. The outside temperature plummeted to -55 degrees, then -60. Marcus had never encountered air this cold during 15 years of flying. Ice was forming on surfaces faster than his de-icing systems could remove it. Frost began appearing on the inside of his cockpit windows despite the cabin heating system running at maximum output. The first real sign of trouble came when his airspeed indicator started fluctuating. The instrument showed his speed varying between normal cruise speed and readings that made no sense. Marcus tapped the gauge, hoping it was just a minor malfunction, but the erratic readings continued. Ice was forming around the pitot tubes that measured airspeed, despite the heating elements designed to prevent exactly this problem. Within minutes, more instruments began showing anomalous readings. His altitude indicator wavered between different values, and his heading compass started drifting unpredictably. Marcus realized that ice was affecting multiple systems simultaneously, overwhelming his aircraft's de-icing capabilities. The extreme cold was causing moisture in the air to freeze instantly on contact with any metal surface. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Ice was forming along the leading edges of his wings, visible through the cockpit windows. The de-icing boots, rubber strips that inflate to crack ice formations, were working continuously, but they couldn't keep up with the rate of ice accumulation. In the span of 10 minutes, his wings had developed a coating of ice nearly an inch thick. Ice accumulation on aircraft wings is extremely dangerous because it changes the aerodynamic properties that generate lift. As ice builds up, the wing's carefully designed shape becomes distorted, reducing its efficiency and making the aircraft heavier. Marcus could feel the plane becoming sluggish, requiring more power to maintain altitude and speed. The cockpit temperature started dropping despite the heating system running at full capacity. Frost formed on interior surfaces, and Marcus could see his breath in the frigid air. The extreme outside temperature was overwhelming his aircraft's environmental systems. His fingers began numbing inside his gloves, making it difficult to operate controls with precision. Warning lights began illuminating across his instrument panel. Engine temperature alarms indicated that the cold air was affecting combustion efficiency. Fuel flow indicators showed irregular readings, as the extreme temperature caused fuel to thicken and flow less efficiently through the system. Every system on the aircraft was being stressed beyond its design limits. Marcus tried climbing to a higher altitude where the air might be warmer, but the aircraft's performance was already compromised by ice accumulation. The engines struggled to provide enough power for a climb, and the ice-covered wings generated less lift than normal. Instead of climbing, he found himself fighting just to maintain level flight. He contacted air traffic control to report his situation. Minneapolis Center, this is Cargo Flight 247. I'm encountering severe icing conditions and instrument malfunctions. Requesting immediate diversion to nearest suitable airport. The controller's voice crackled back through his radio. Cargo 247, understand you're requesting diversion. What's your current position and altitude? Marcus looked at his instruments, but the readings were so erratic he couldn't provide accurate information. His GPS was still functioning, showing his position over northern Wisconsin, but most other instruments were unreliable. I'm approximately 50 miles southwest of Green Bay at flight level 280, but my instruments are compromised by ice formation. Cargo 247 Green Bay Airport is reporting clear conditions. Can you maintain current altitude for vectors to Green Bay? Marcus tried to sound confident in his response, but he could feel the aircraft becoming more difficult to control with each passing minute. Negative on maintaining altitude. Aircraft performance is degraded by ice accumulation. I may need to descend. The situation was rapidly becoming critical. Ice continued building on all external surfaces despite his de-icing systems running continuously. The aircraft felt increasingly unstable, requiring constant attention to keep it flying straight and level. Marcus realized he was facing exactly the scenario that Sarah had warned him about: catastrophic icing caused by extreme atmospheric conditions. As he struggled with the controls, Marcus thought about Sarah's words from that morning. She had called it a death trap, predicting that his de-icing systems wouldn't be adequate for the extreme conditions. He had dismissed her warning as overcautious, but now he was living proof of her accuracy. The Arctic air mass she had tracked was turning his aircraft into a flying ice sculpture. The reality of his situation hit him with full force. He was flying a compromised aircraft through conditions that were beyond anything in his training or experience. His instruments were unreliable, his performance was degraded, and he was still hours away from his destination. For the first time in his flying career, Marcus Chen felt genuinely afraid. In that moment of fear and recognition, he made a decision that would save his life. He reached for his radio to make a call he had never made before, a call to someone on the ground who understood the weather better than anyone else he knew. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for the radio, not entirely from the cold. Swallowing his pride was never easy, but his survival instincts were stronger than his ego. He switched to the emergency frequency and made the call that would change everything. "This is Cargo Flight 247 to any station. Requesting contact with Sarah Williams, meteorologist at Riverside Regional Airport. Emergency situation in progress." The response came quickly from a relay station. "Cargo 247, we're patching you through to Riverside Regional. Stand by." Within seconds, a familiar voice came through the static. "Marcus, this is Sarah. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies since you took off. What's your situation?" Despite everything happening around him, Marcus felt a wave of relief hearing her voice. "Sarah, you were right about everything. I'm in severe icing conditions over Wisconsin. Outside air temperature is minus 62 degrees. My de-icing systems can't keep up and most of my instruments are compromised. Okay, Marcus, I need you to stay calm and listen carefully." Sarah's voice was steady and professional. "I've been tracking that Arctic air mass all morning. You're flying through the core of it right now, where temperatures are the most extreme. The good news is that you can get out of it, but you need to follow my guidance exactly." Marcus looked at his wings again and saw that ice accumulation had increased dramatically in just the past few minutes. The coating was now thick enough to significantly change the wing's shape. His aircraft was handling like a truck rather than an airplane, requiring constant corrections to maintain level flight. "Sarah, I can barely control the aircraft. The ice is building faster than I can remove it. My engines are running rough and I'm losing altitude despite full power." "I understand. Here's what we're going to do," Sarah replied. "That Arctic air mass has a very specific three-dimensional structure. You're currently in the coldest layer, but there's warmer air both above and below you. The problem is that climbing will take you into even worse icing conditions temporarily." Marcus checked his altimeter, though he wasn't sure how accurate it was anymore. "I'm showing approximately 27,000 feet, but I can't trust my instruments. Based on radar tracking and atmospheric models, I believe you're actually at about 26,000 feet. The extreme cold is affecting your pressure instruments. Now listen carefully. You need to descend immediately to 18,000 feet. The air temperature at that altitude should be around minus 35 degrees, which your de-icing systems can handle." "Descending now," Marcus replied, pushing the control yoke forward. The aircraft responded sluggishly like a heavy truck going downhill. Ice chunks broke off the wings as he changed altitude, some pieces striking the fuselage with metallic thuds that echoed through the cockpit. As he descended, Sarah continued her guidance. "Marcus, I need you to report your engine parameters. Are you experiencing any power loss or unusual readings?" Marcus scanned his engine instruments, trying to distinguish between real problems and ice-related sensor malfunctions. Both engines are running rough. Oil pressure is lower than normal, and fuel consumption is higher. I think the cold air is affecting combustion efficiency. That's normal for these extreme temperatures. Your engines are working harder because the air density is much higher than normal. Reduce power slightly to prevent overheating, but maintain enough thrust for controlled descent. The descent through 22,000 feet brought Marcus into a layer of clouds that he hadn't seen from above. Suddenly his aircraft was flying through visible moisture, and ice accumulation accelerated dramatically. Warning lights illuminated across his panel as sensors detected rapid ice buildup on critical surfaces. "Sarah, I'm in clouds now and icing is getting worse. I can feel the aircraft getting heavier. You're passing through a moisture layer. This is temporary, but you need to get through it quickly. Increase your rate of descent to 1,500 feet per minute. I know it feels dangerous, but staying in that moisture layer longer will make things worse." Marcus increased his descent rate, feeling the aircraft shudder as it pushed through the ice-laden clouds. Chunks of ice continued breaking off the wings and striking the fuselage. The sounds were terrifying, like rocks hitting a tin roof. But Sarah had warned him this would happen as he changed altitudes and air pressure. "Talk to me about what you're seeing outside," Sarah requested. "Are you still in clouds or can you see the ground?" "Still in clouds, but they're getting lighter. I can see occasional breaks showing snow-covered ground below." "Wait. Breaking out of the cloud layer now at about 19,000 feet. Excellent. Continue descent to 18,000 and level off there. The air temperature should start improving as you get lower." As Marcus approached 18,000 feet, he began noticing improvements in his aircraft's performance. The outside air temperature had risen to -40 degrees, still extremely cold, but within the range his de-icing systems were designed to handle. Ice accumulation slowed and his engines began running more smoothly. "Sarah, I think it's working. Temperature is improving and my engines sound better. But I've still got a lot of ice on the wings." "Good. Now we need to get you completely out of this Arctic air mass. Based on my tracking data, you need to change course to avoid the worst of it. Can you turn to heading 270 and maintain that course?" Marcus checked his compass, grateful that it seemed to be working properly again at the lower altitude. "Turning to 270 now. Should I continue toward Minneapolis?" "Absolutely not. Minneapolis is directly in the path of the worst conditions. I'm vectoring you around the southern edge of this system. There's an airport in Madison, Wisconsin that's reporting clear conditions and normal temperatures. That's where we're taking you." The course change brought Marcus into noticeably warmer air. The outside temperature continued rising, reaching -30 degrees, then -25. His aircraft's performance continued improving as they left the core of the Arctic air mass behind them. "Marcus, how are your fuel levels?" Sarah asked. He checked his fuel gauges, which were now providing consistent readings. "I've got about 40% remaining. The higher fuel consumption in those extreme conditions used more than expected. That's cutting it close, but you'll make it to Madison with reserves. I'm coordinating with Madison Approach Control to have emergency equipment standing by. They're also preparing heated hangar space so your aircraft can thaw out properly." As they flew south toward Madison, Marcus could see the dramatic difference in weather conditions. Ahead of them, the sky was lighter, with scattered clouds instead of the ominous gray mass they had left behind. The contrast was striking, like flying from winter into early spring in the span of 30 minutes. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," Marcus said as his aircraft continued warming up and performing normally. "How did you know exactly where to send me? You guided me through that descent like you could see exactly what I was facing. I've been tracking this weather system for 18 hours, building a 3-dimensional model of its structure. When you reported your position and conditions, I could pinpoint exactly where you were within the system and calculate the best escape route. It's what meteorologists do. We create mental maps of the atmosphere." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing everything that had happened. His pride had nearly cost him his life, while the person he had consistently ignored had just saved him from a catastrophic situation. "Sarah, I owe you an apology, and probably my life." The approach into Madison felt like landing on a different planet compared to the nightmare Marcus had just experienced. The outside air temperature had risen to a comfortable -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and his aircraft was performing normally again. Ice was still shedding from the wings and fuselage, creating a trail of frozen debris behind him. But the worst was over. "Madison Tower. This is Cargo Flight 247 on emergency approach," Marcus radioed as he lined up for landing. "Aircraft has experienced severe icing. Requesting direct routing to heated hangar facilities. Cargo 247 Madison Tower. Emergency equipment is standing by. Wind is calm, runway 21 clear and dry. You're cleared for straight-in approach." As Marcus descended toward the runway, he could see fire trucks and emergency vehicles positioned alongside the taxiway, their red and blue lights flashing in the morning sunlight. It was a sobering reminder of how close he had come to disaster. Without Sarah's guidance, he might not have made it to any airport at all. The landing was smooth despite the ice still coating parts of his aircraft. As he taxied toward the hangar, chunks of ice continued falling from the wings and engines, leaving a trail of frozen debris on the taxiway. Ground crews directed him into a heated maintenance hangar, where the remaining ice could safely melt off his aircraft. Once the engines were shut down, Marcus sat in the cockpit for several minutes processing what had just happened. His hands were still shaking slightly and not from the cold anymore. In 15 years of flying, he had never experienced anything so terrifying or dangerous. The realization that he had dismissed expert advice and nearly paid for it with his life was difficult to accept. His satellite phone rang. It was Sarah calling from the airport. "Marcus, how are you feeling?" "Are you okay?" "Physically, I'm fine. Mentally, I'm still processing everything. Sarah, I need to ask you something honestly. How bad was it really? How close did I come to not making it?" There was a pause before Sarah answered. "Honestly, if you had continued on your original course for another 30 minutes, your aircraft would have accumulated so much ice that it probably would have been uncontrollable. The weight and aerodynamic changes would have made it impossible to maintain level flight. You were maybe 20 minutes away from a catastrophic situation." Marcus felt his stomach drop. 20 minutes. The difference between life and death had been measured in minutes, and his stubborn refusal to listen to expert advice had nearly cost him everything. "Marcus, are you still there?" "I'm here. Just trying to wrap my head around how stupid I was this morning. You tried to warn me, gave me specific information about dangerous conditions, and I ignored you because I thought I knew better. You're not the first pilot to ignore weather warnings, and you won't be the last. The important thing is that you're safe now, and hopefully you've learned something from this experience." Marcus looked out at the ice-covered aircraft around him. Maintenance workers were already examining his plane, documenting the extent of ice damage and checking for any structural problems caused by the extreme conditions. "I've definitely learned something. I've learned that meteorology is a lot more complex than I gave it credit for. And I've learned that expertise comes in many forms, not just flying experience. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot coming from you. Sarah, I need you to know something. When I was up there struggling with those controls, when I realized my aircraft was basically turning into a flying ice cube, the first person I thought to call was you, even though I had spent months dismissing your advice when my life was on the line. I knew you were the person who could help me." That took courage, Marcus. It's not easy to admit when we need help, especially in a crisis situation. Over the next hour, as maintenance crews worked on his aircraft, Marcus found himself having the longest conversation he had ever had with Sarah Williams. She explained the meteorological phenomena that had created the dangerous conditions, how Arctic air masses could create temperature extremes that overwhelmed normal aircraft systems, how moisture interacted with supercooled air to create rapid ice formation, and how atmospheric pressure changes affected instrument readings. "The thing that makes these situations so dangerous," Sarah explained, "is that they look normal on standard weather reports. The official forecast showed cold but flyable conditions because the instruments measuring surface weather don't capture the extreme variations that can occur at different altitudes. So how did you know when the official forecast didn't?" "I use additional data sources that most people don't pay attention to. Satellite imagery showing cloud top temperatures, upper atmosphere pressure readings from weather balloons, and computer models that analyze how different air masses interact in 3 dimensions. It's like putting together a puzzle where most people only see a few pieces." Marcus was fascinated by the complexity of her work. "You're basically creating a 3-dimensional map of the atmosphere in your head." "Exactly. And when I saw the data yesterday evening, I knew there would be dangerous conditions along your flight route this morning. The Arctic air mass was moving faster and colder than the official forecast predicted. Why do you keep trying to warn pilots who often ignore your advice? It must be frustrating." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because I can't live with the idea that someone might get hurt when I had information that could prevent it. Even if pilots don't listen 90% of the time, that 10% when they do listen might save lives." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus learned that his aircraft would need to remain in Madison for extensive inspection and minor repairs. The extreme icing had caused some damage to external sensors and required replacement of several weather instruments. He would be staying overnight while the work was completed. That evening, Sarah drove down from their home airport to Madison, a 3-hour drive, to check on him in person. When she arrived at his hotel, Marcus was surprised by the gesture. "You didn't have to drive all the way down here," he said as they met in the hotel lobby. "I wanted to make sure you were really okay. Going through something like that can be more traumatic than people realize." They sat in the hotel restaurant, and for the first time, Marcus and Sarah had a conversation that wasn't about weather or flying. He learned that she had become interested in meteorology after experiencing a tornado as a child in Oklahoma. The experience of seeing how quickly weather could turn dangerous had shaped her entire career focus. I've always been fascinated by the power of nature and the importance of understanding it rather than fighting it, she explained. Weather systems are like living things. They have personalities, behaviors, and patterns. When you learn to read those patterns, you can predict what they'll do next. I think I've been approaching flying the wrong way, Marcus admitted. I've been treating weather as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a force to understand and work with. That's a common attitude in aviation. Pilots are trained to be confident and decisive, which are good qualities, but sometimes those same qualities can make it hard to accept guidance or admit uncertainty. Well, I'm definitely more uncertain about my weather judgment now, in a good way. As they talked late into the evening, Marcus realized that his relationship with Sarah was changing fundamentally. She was no longer just the meteorologist who gave unwanted advice. She was a highly skilled professional whose expertise had literally saved his life. More than that, she was someone he respected and wanted to know better. Sarah, when I get back to flying, I want to do things differently. I want to understand weather the way you do. Would you be willing to teach me? 3 weeks after the emergency landing in Madison, Marcus returned to work with a completely different perspective on weather and flying. His aircraft had been thoroughly inspected and repaired, with new sensors and updated de-icing systems installed. But the real change wasn't in his equipment. It was in his approach to flight planning and weather assessment. Sarah had agreed to help him understand meteorology from a pilot's perspective. They began meeting every morning before his flights, not just for her to give warnings, but for her to teach him how to read the same data she used to make her predictions. It was like learning a new language, the language of the atmosphere. Look at this satellite image, Sarah said during one of their morning sessions, pointing to her computer screen. What do you see? Marcus studied the swirling patterns of clouds over the Midwest. I see clouds moving from west to east, some areas of clear sky and what looks like a storm system developing over Colorado. Good start. Now look at the cloud top temperatures shown in these color codes. The bright white areas indicate extremely cold cloud tops, which means very tall storm systems with a lot of energy. And see how the wind patterns are converging here over Iowa? That's where the real weather is going to develop today. Over several weeks, Marcus learned to interpret wind shear data, pressure gradients, and moisture levels in ways he had never understood before. Sarah taught him how weather systems developed and moved, how to spot the early signs of dangerous conditions, and most importantly, how to recognize when conditions were beyond his aircraft's capabilities. The key is understanding your limits, Sarah explained during one lesson. Every aircraft has performance envelopes for different weather conditions. Your job as a pilot is to know those limits and respect them, not to test them. Marcus's newfound weather knowledge quickly proved valuable. On his first flight after returning to service, he was scheduled to fly to Detroit, when Sarah showed him data indicating severe turbulence developing along his route. This time, he didn't hesitate to delay the flight by 2 hours. When the delayed departure kept him clear of turbulence that grounded other aircraft, Marcus understood the practical value of Sarah's expertise. Word spread quickly among other pilots at the airport about Marcus's transformation. The pilot who had been famous for ignoring weather warnings was now the one asking the most detailed questions during flight briefings. Some colleagues teased him about becoming weather-obsessed, but the ribbing was good-natured and respectful. Marcus has discovered what the rest of us figured out years ago, said Captain Thompson, a veteran pilot with 30 years' experience. Sarah Williams knows more about flying weather than most of us know about flying. Smart pilots listen to her. But Marcus's relationship with Sarah was developing beyond professional collaboration. Their daily weather briefings had expanded into longer conversations about atmospheric science, aviation technology, and eventually more personal topics. Marcus found himself looking forward to their morning meetings for reasons that had nothing to do with weather. You're different from when I first met you, Sarah observed one morning as they reviewed forecasts for his upcoming flight to Atlanta. More thoughtful, more willing to consider information that doesn't match your initial assumptions. Almost dying has a way of changing your perspective, Marcus replied. But it's more than that. Working with you has taught me that being a good pilot means more than just knowing how to operate an aircraft. It means understanding the environment you're operating in, and understanding that you don't have to make every decision alone. Aviation is supposed to be a team effort, Pilots, air traffic control, meteorologists, maintenance crews. Everyone brings different expertise to keep flight safe. As spring arrived, Marcus and Sarah's working relationship had evolved into something deeper. They began spending time together outside of work, hiking on weekends and exploring their shared interest in weather phenomena. Sarah showed Marcus how to spot different cloud formations and predict local weather changes, while Marcus taught her about aircraft systems and flight operations. Their colleagues at the airport noticed the growing friendship with approval and some gentle teasing. "Looks like our weather witch has tamed the cowboy pilot," joked one of the ground crew members. But the comment was made with affection. Everyone could see that both Marcus and Sarah had benefited from their partnership. One evening in late April, as they watched a spectacular thunderstorm develop on the horizon from the airport observation deck, Sarah made an observation that surprised Marcus. "You know, that emergency in February might have been the best thing that could have happened to you as a pilot." Marcus looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Almost crashing was good for me?" "Not the almost crashing part, but the experience of having to trust someone else's expertise, of learning that you didn't know everything you needed to know. That made you a better pilot. And probably a better person. It definitely made me more humble and more grateful for people who know things I don't know. Like meteorology, and like how to make coffee that doesn't taste like motor oil, how to read people's emotions, how to explain complex scientific concepts so they make sense to pilots, and about a dozen other things you're better at than I am." Sarah smiled. "Are you saying you've learned to appreciate expertise even when it comes from someone who doesn't have a pilot's license?" "I'm saying I've learned to appreciate you. For your expertise, your patience with stubborn pilots, your dedication to keeping people safe, and for who you are as a person." The thunderstorm in the distance lit up the evening sky with spectacular lightning displays. Marcus and Sarah stood watching in comfortable silence, both thinking about how much their relationship had changed since that frigid February morning, when pride and expertise had clashed in a potentially deadly confrontation. "Marcus, can I tell you something?" Sarah said quietly. "Of course. That morning when you ignored my warning and took off anyway, I was genuinely terrified that something terrible would happen to you. I spent the entire morning monitoring emergency frequencies, tracking weather data, and waiting for bad news." "You were monitoring emergency frequencies all morning?" "I monitor them whenever I think a pilot might be flying into dangerous conditions, especially pilots who ignore my warnings. I feel responsible for their safety whether they want my help or not." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "So when I called for help, you were already prepared to assist me. I had been tracking that weather system all night, building detailed models of its structure and movement. When you radioed for help, I knew exactly where you were and how to get you out safely. You saved my life, Sarah, not just by guiding me out of that weather, but by caring enough to be prepared when I needed help, even after I had dismissed your advice. That's what we do for people we care about. We watch out for them, even when they're too stubborn to watch out for themselves." As the thunderstorm moved closer, bringing the first drops of rain, Marcus realized that his feelings for Sarah had grown far beyond professional respect or gratitude. She had become the most important person in his life, someone whose wisdom and caring had changed him fundamentally, as both a pilot and a person. 6 months after the emergency that changed his life, Marcus found himself facing an unexpected opportunity that would test everything he had learned about weather, flying, and trusting expert advice. The airline he worked for had offered him a promotion to chief pilot, responsible for training other pilots in advanced weather operations and emergency procedures. "They want me to develop a new weather awareness program for all company pilots," Marcus explained to Sarah over dinner at their favorite restaurant. "Apparently my experience and the way I've changed my approach to weather flying has impressed management." Sarah smiled across the table. "That's wonderful, Marcus. You've become exactly the kind of pilot who should be training others, someone who understands both the technical and human factors involved in weather decision-making. The thing is, I can't do this program without you. I want you to be the co-developer and lead instructor for the meteorology components. The program would combine pilot decision-making with real meteorological science." "Are you asking me to leave my job at the airport?" "I'm asking you to help create something that could save lives. a training program that teaches pilots to work with meteorologists as partners, rather than viewing weather advice as unwanted interference. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. It would mean traveling to different airline facilities, training pilots who might be even more resistant to weather guidance than you used to be. Some of them will be resistant, but others will be like I am now, pilots who have learned that expertise comes in many forms and that the best decisions are made with the best available information. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Sarah worked together to develop a comprehensive weather training program that combined meteorological science with practical flight operations. They created scenarios based on real weather events, including detailed recreations of the Arctic, air mass encounter that had brought them together. The program's first test came when they were invited to present it to a group of senior pilots at a major airline's training facility. Marcus was nervous as they prepared for the presentation. Many of these pilots had decades of experience and might view weather training as unnecessary. "Remember," Sarah said as they set up their equipment, "we're not trying to convince them they don't know how to fly. We're showing them additional tools that can make their flying safer and more efficient." The presentation began with Marcus telling the story of his near disaster in February, describing how his confidence and experience had nearly led to catastrophe. He explained how his initial resistance to meteorological advice had been based on misunderstanding rather than wisdom. "I thought being a good pilot meant making independent decisions based on my own experience," Marcus told the assembled pilots. "What I learned is that being a good pilot means making informed decisions based on the best available expertise, whether that expertise comes from my own experience or from specialists who understand things I don't." Sarah then presented the meteorological science behind weather hazards, using sophisticated computer models and satellite imagery to show how weather systems developed and moved. She explained how pilots could interpret the same data she used to make forecasts, giving them tools to assess weather conditions beyond standard briefings. "The goal isn't to turn pilots into meteorologists," Sarah explained. "The goal is to help pilots understand what meteorologists see so they can make better decisions about when and how to fly through challenging weather." The response from the experienced pilots was initially skeptical. Several questioned whether additional weather training was necessary for pilots who had been flying safely for years. But as Sarah demonstrated how sophisticated weather analysis could predict hazards that didn't show up in standard forecasts, attitudes began changing. "I've been flying for 28 years, said Captain Rodriguez, a senior pilot with extensive international experience. "I thought I understood weather pretty well. But what you're showing us is a level of atmospheric analysis that I never knew existed." The breakthrough came when Sarah showed real-time satellite data of a developing weather system and predicted exactly where turbulence would occur over the next 6 hours. When pilots checked with air traffic control, they confirmed that aircraft were already reporting turbulence in exactly the locations Sarah had identified. "How did you know that?" asked Captain Martinez, clearly impressed. "By understanding how wind shear develops when different air masses interact," Sarah replied. "The turbulence was predictable if you knew what signs to look for in the upper atmosphere data." The training session, that had been scheduled for 2 hours, extended to 4 hours as pilots asked increasingly sophisticated questions about weather prediction and atmospheric science. Marcus watched with satisfaction as the same transformation he had experienced began happening with other experienced aviators. "This is exactly what happened to me," Marcus told Sarah during a break. "Once pilots understand the complexity and sophistication of meteorological science, they realize how much they can benefit from working with weather experts." The success of their first presentation led to requests from other airlines and flight training organizations. Marcus and Sarah found themselves traveling across the country, presenting their weather training program to pilots, dispatchers, and airline management. Each presentation reinforced their belief that aviation safety could be improved by better communication between pilots and meteorologists. But the program's real test came during a winter storm season that brought some of the most challenging weather conditions in years. Airlines that had implemented Marcus and Sarah's training program reported significantly fewer weather-related delays and incidents compared to those using traditional weather briefing procedures. Pilots, who understand meteorological decision-making, are making better choices about when to fly, when to delay, and when to divert, explained Dr. Roberts. an aviation safety researcher, who had been studying their program's effectiveness. The result is not just safer operations but more efficient ones. The success led to recognition from the aviation industry and invitations to speak at major conferences. Marcus found himself being interviewed by aviation magazines about his transformation, from a pilot who ignored weather advice to an advocate for meteorological collaboration. The irony is that I'm now famous for something I initially resisted, Marcus told Sarah as they prepared for a presentation at the National Aviation Weather Conference. I've become the poster pilot for listening to meteorologists. You've become something more important than that, Sarah replied. You've become proof that people can change, learn from mistakes, and grow. That's a powerful message for any profession. As they stood together preparing for their presentation to hundreds of pilots, meteorologists, and aviation safety experts, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The emergency that had nearly killed him had become the foundation for a career focused on preventing similar incidents for other pilots. Are you ready for this? Sarah asked as they heard their names being announced. With you as my partner, I'm ready for anything. As they walked onto the stage together, Marcus realized that his partnership with Sarah had become about much more than weather and flying. They had created something that was making aviation safer, while building a relationship based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and deep personal connection. 2 years after the emergency that changed everything, Marcus stood at the altar of a small church outside their home airport, watching Sarah walk down the aisle in a beautiful white dress. The congregation was filled with pilots, meteorologists, air traffic controllers, and aviation professionals who had witnessed their unlikely partnership develop into something extraordinary. Captain Thompson, Marcus's longtime colleague, served as best man. Who would have thought, he whispered as Sarah approached, that our most stubborn pilot would end up marrying the weather witch who saved his life? Marcus smiled but kept his eyes on Sarah. She looked radiant, carrying a bouquet of flowers that somehow managed to match the sky-blue color of a perfect flying day. As she reached the altar, Marcus thought about all the storms they had weathered together, both literally and figuratively. The ceremony was officiated by Chaplain Williams, a retired Air Force pilot who had known both Marcus and Sarah through their work at the airport. He had insisted on incorporating aviation themes into the service, comparing marriage to a 2-person flight crew, working together through all weather conditions. Marcus and Sarah have already proven they can navigate through the most challenging conditions life can throw at them, Chaplain Williams said to the assembled guests. They've learned to trust each other's expertise, to communicate clearly during emergencies, and to work as a team toward common goals. These are the same qualities that make a great marriage. During the exchange of vows, Marcus looked into Sarah's eyes and spoke from the heart. Sarah, you saved my life in more ways than one. You taught me that wisdom comes from many sources, that asking for help is a sign of strength, and that the best decisions are made by people who respect each other's knowledge. I promise to trust your judgment, to listen to your advice, and to weather every storm alongside you. Sarah's vows brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. Marcus, you taught me that people can change, that admitting mistakes takes courage, and that partnership means more than just working together. It means caring enough to take risks for each other. I promise to watch over you, to guide you when you need direction, and to celebrate every safe landing in our journey together. The reception was held in the airport's main hangar, decorated with white lights and aviation-themed centerpieces. Tables were named after different types of clouds rather than numbers, and the cake was shaped like an aircraft emerging from storm clouds into clear skies. During the reception, colleagues shared stories about Marcus and Sarah's professional partnership and its impact on aviation safety. Dr. Roberts, the aviation safety researcher, presented data showing that their weather training program had contributed to a 23% reduction in weather-related incidents among airlines that had implemented it. Marcus and Sarah have proven that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the most extraordinary results, Dr. Roberts said during his toast. Their work has literally saved lives and made aviation safer for everyone. Captain Rodriguez, one of the pilots from their first training presentation, stood to share his own story. 2 months after attending Marcus and Sarah's weather training, I encountered severe turbulence on a flight to Miami. Because of what they taught me about reading atmospheric data, I was able to request a route change that avoided the worst conditions. My passengers experienced a smooth flight instead of a terrifying one. That's the kind of real-world impact their partnership creates. As the evening continued, Marcus and Sarah found themselves surrounded by friends and colleagues who had become family over the past 2 years. The meteorology team from their home airport had created a special weather forecast as a wedding gift, a detailed analysis showing perfect flying conditions for their honeymoon flight to Hawaii. "No storms, no turbulence, and smooth flying all the way," said Linda Peterson, Sarah's former supervisor. "We've guaranteed good weather for your first flight as a married couple." Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Marcus and Sarah stepped outside the hangar to look at the stars. Aircraft lights moved across the clear night sky, following invisible highways through the atmosphere that Sarah understood better than almost anyone. "Do you ever think about that morning in February?" Marcus asked as they watched a commercial airliner pass overhead. "Every day," Sarah replied. "Not because it was traumatic, but because it was the beginning of everything good that followed. Your near disaster became the foundation for our professional success, our personal relationship, and our marriage." I was thinking about something earlier during the ceremony. When you were giving me directions during that emergency, you told me to trust your guidance exactly, and I did, even though it went against every instinct I had as a pilot. What made you decide to trust me? Because I realized that my survival depended on putting aside my ego and accepting help from someone who knew more than I did about the situation I was facing. It was the first time in my life I had truly trusted someone else's expertise over my own judgment. Sarah smiled, and look how that worked out. It changed everything, not just my approach to flying, but my understanding of what it means to be part of a team, and eventually it led to understanding what it means to be part of a partnership. As they stood together under the stars, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The emergency that had nearly cost him his life had become the catalyst for the most rewarding period of his career and the most important relationship of his life. "Sarah, I have a confession to make." "What's that?" "I'm actually grateful for that emergency now. Not for the danger or the fear, but for what it taught me and where it led us. If I hadn't been stubborn enough to ignore your warning that morning, none of this would have happened." "Are you saying you're glad you almost crashed?" "I'm saying I'm glad I learned that the best pilots are the ones who know when to listen to expert advice. And I'm grateful that the expert whose advice I finally learned to trust turned out to be the woman I wanted to spend my life with." 3 months later, Marcus and Sarah were back at work, continuing to develop and present their weather training program while building their life together. They had moved into a house near the airport with large windows that provided perfect views of approaching weather systems. Sarah had installed a sophisticated home weather station that allowed her to track atmospheric conditions around the clock. "Old habits," she explained to Marcus when he found her checking wind data at midnight during their first week in the new house. "I don't mind," Marcus replied. "I like being married to someone who can predict tomorrow's flying conditions while I'm still asleep." Their partnership had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something deeper and more comprehensive. Marcus had learned to read basic weather patterns well enough to assist Sarah with her forecasting work, while Sarah had become knowledgeable enough about aircraft systems to understand the technical implications of different weather conditions on flight operations. One evening, as they reviewed weather data for the next day's flights, Sarah made an observation that brought their story full circle. "Marcus, do you see this developing system over the Pacific Northwest?" Marcus studied the satellite imagery and pressure charts. "Looks like another Arctic air mass moving south. Temperature differential is extreme. Reminds me of the system that nearly got me 2 years ago." "Exactly. And we have 3 cargo flights scheduled through that region tomorrow morning. What should we do?" Marcus smiled as he reached for the phone to contact the airline dispatch office. "We're going to call those pilots and recommend delay until the system passes through completely. And this time I'm betting they'll listen to our advice." "What makes you so confident?" "Because the pilot flying that route tomorrow is Captain Martinez. He attended our second training seminar and has become one of our strongest advocates for weather collaboration." As Marcus made the call to recommend flight delays, Sarah watched with satisfaction. The stubborn pilot who had once ignored weather warnings was now actively working to prevent other pilots from making the same potentially deadly mistake he had made. The story that began with pride, miscommunication, and near disaster had become a tale of partnership, growth, and love. Marcus and Sarah had proven that the most unlikely combinations, a stubborn pilot and a persistent meteorologist, could create something extraordinary when trust, respect, and shared purpose brought them together. Their emergency had become their beginning. Their professional partnership had evolved into personal love, and their individual expertise had combined to make aviation safer for everyone who flew through the skies. They both understood so well.